Yeah.
Ever imagine yourself up in the cockpit, soaring through the clouds? Well, today, we're going to be diving into the world of instrument flying, where pilots, they have to navigate using only their instruments instead of relying on what they can see out the window.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating stuff because it's almost like they develop like a sixth sense.
Yeah.
They have to interpret all this data and then they build this mental picture of where they are and make these decisions based on that alone.
It's really like solving this 3D puzzle while moving at hundreds of miles per hour.
Right.
We've got some excerpts here from a couple pilot handbooks today. One uses the classic analog instruments, and then another one that explains these modern electronic flight displays, which are called EFDs. And we're going to uncover how pilots use these tools to stay on course when they can't even see the horizon.
It's kind of like comparing a paper map to a GPS.
Oh, yeah.
Both can get you to your destination, but the way you use them is completely different.
Right. Okay, so let's start with something that sounds pretty simple, straight and level flight. You know how a plane's nose can point up and down during flight? Well, that's called pitch attitude, and it directly affects the plane's speed.
Yeah, and when you can't see the horizon, maintaining a steady pitch attitude can be a real challenge.
Right.
Our analog source has these great diagrams
Yeah.
showing how the plane's nose needs to be positioned differently for different speeds. Nose high for a slow cruise, nose low for a faster one. It's all about finding that delicate balance.
Interesting. And then there's this thing called trimming. It's basically like fine-tuning those controls so that the plane kind of wants to stay in that balanced state.
Exactly. Think of it like if you're driving a car and it's constantly pulling to one side. You're having to fight the steering wheel the whole time. Trimming is like adjusting the alignment so the car drives straight with less effort.
Okay.
It reduces the pilot workload and can even help save fuel.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, our EFD source stresses the importance of a light touch on the controls. So it seems like a steady hand is really key for instrument flying.
Oh, absolutely. And that comes with practice.
Okay.
One thing that's interesting is how both sources point out that the altimeter, the instrument that tells you your altitude, can also give you clues about your pitch attitude.
Really? So you're saying if the altimeter shows you're climbing, then you're probably nose high, even if you can't see it out the window.
Exactly. It's all about interpreting those subtle clues that the instruments are giving you. And experienced pilots, they'll even go a step further. They'll cross-check multiple instruments like the altimeter, the vertical speed indicator, and the airspeed indicator to get a complete picture of what the plane is actually doing.
So it's not just about glancing at a single instrument, but understanding the relationships between all of them.
That's right.
It's like a detective piecing together clues.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And to really master this skill, pilots even train to fly without the attitude indicator.
Yeah.
That instrument that shows the plane's orientation relative to the horizon.
Wow, talk about a challenge. But I guess that must build incredible resilience in case an instrument fails.
Precisely. It forces them to rely on their other instruments and their understanding and how the plane behaves in different situations.
Now, our handbooks, they also dive into bank control, which is all about keeping the plane on track during turns.
You see, bank attitude refers to the angle of the wings relative to the horizon.
Yeah.
So when you turn, you're essentially banking the plane.
Okay, I'm picturing like a motorcycle leaning into a turn.
Exactly. And just like with a motorcycle, you need to control that lean to stay balanced. That's where the turn coordinator comes in. The analog version has this miniature airplane that tilts to show both how fast the plane is rolling and how quickly it's turning.
Oh, okay. Our EFD source shows us information digitally, of course. But there was one detail that caught my eye, the turn coordinator's ball.
Ah, yes, the ball. It might seem like a small detail, but it's actually a very important indicator. It tells you
So if that ball's centered, you're good. If it's off center, then you're like, that car's skidding on ice.
Right.
You got to adjust.
Exactly. It might seem like a minor thing,
Right.
but slips and skids create this extra drag, and they make the plane much less efficient. Plus, in extreme cases, they can even lead to a loss of control.
Wow. So even something as simple as just keeping the ball centered is super crucial for smooth, safe, and efficient flight. It really shows how interconnected all these aspects of aircraft control are.
Absolutely. It's all about maintaining that delicate balance of forces.
Now, speaking of balance, let's talk about airspeed changes. So imagine you're cruising along and you need to slow down for landing or maybe speed up for a climb, but you still need to stay at a specific altitude. So how do pilots manage that with only their instruments to guide them?
It's kind of like a juggling act,
Okay.
coordinating the pitch and the power. Our analog source shows that if you simply reduce power to slow down, the plane's nose will naturally drop. That causes you to lose altitude.
So you can't just pull back on the throttle and call it a day.
Nope. You have to adjust the pitch simultaneously to counteract that nose-down tendency.
Gotcha. And then there's this thing called overpowering or underpowering. It's like using a bit more or less power than you technically need during the transition to help control the altitude while the airspeed is changing.
Think of it like riding a bicycle uphill. If you want to maintain a steady speed while shifting to a lower gear, you need to pedal a bit harder during the shift.
Ah, so overpowering is like giving the plane that extra pedal stroke to prevent it from losing altitude while slowing down?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And our EFD source explains how pilots use this airspeed trend vector to anticipate how quickly the plane will reach the desired speed.
Interesting.
It's all about anticipating the plane's response and making those adjustments accordingly.
Yeah, it sounds like a constant mental game of prediction and adjustment. But as you said earlier, experienced pilots, they get really good at this by constantly cross-checking their instruments.
Absolutely. They're always monitoring the altitude and the airspeed, looking for those subtle clues that tell them if they need to adjust the pitch or the power. It's a very dynamic process that requires a lot of mental agility.
Wow. So we've talked about maintaining like a steady course and speed, but what about taking off when you can't even see the runway?
Yeah, that's where instrument takeoffs come in, and they demand an incredible amount of trust in your instruments and training.
Talk about a huge leap of faith. Our analog source breaks down this process step by step, starting with carefully aligning that heading indicator with the runway.
And using the rudder to keep the plane centered, like staying in your lane on a highway even though you can't actually see the road.
Oh, wow. And then as the plane accelerates, the pilot smoothly transitions to a climb attitude, all based on what that attitude indicator is telling them.
All while checking the airspeed, of
Mm.
course, to make sure they're not going too slow or too fast.
Yeah,
It's a pretty critical balance.
gotcha. And here's where the modern EFDs have a cool trick up their sleeve. Our EFD source says some systems can actually project a virtual image of the runway onto the display.
Yeah, it's like having an augmented reality view of the runway right there in the cockpit.
Wow.
This gives pilots even more situational awareness, especially in those low visibility conditions.
That's amazing. But even with all these fancy displays, pilots still need to have a deep understanding of how the plane handles, especially when the landing gear and flaps are retracting.
Yeah, it's like knowing how your car handles differently when you're going uphill or turning a corner.
Yeah.
Pilots anticipate these changes in control pressures to keep the plane flying smoothly.
So instrument takeoffs are really the ultimate test of a pilot's skill and confidence.
For sure. They have to rely solely on their instruments and their training to navigate a situation that would make most people feel completely disoriented.
Yeah, for sure. Now we tackled takeoffs, but what about when you need to change direction in the air? We've already talked about standard rate turns, which are kind of like the bread and butter of maneuvering.
Right. But let's say you need to turn to a specific heading, like when you're following an airway or maybe lining up for landing. That requires a little extra finesse.
Okay, our analog source has some handy rules of thumb for this. For small heading changes, the bank angle shouldn't be any greater than the number of degrees you need to turn.
And you actually start rolling out of the turn a little bit before reaching that target, heading to account for the plane's momentum. It's called leading the turn.
Oh, so it's not as simple as just turning the yoke and waiting to reach the heading.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It's all about anticipating the plane's response and making those smooth and coordinated movements.
Okay, so what about when you have to make like larger heading changes?
Then it gets even trickier because remember that bank angle for a standard rate turn changes depending on your airspeed.
Right, we talked about that earlier. So for bigger turns, the amount of lead you need changes as well.
Exactly. It takes experience and a good feel for the aircraft to get it just right.
Our handbooks also mention timed turns, which are used to turn a precise number of degrees in a specific amount of time.
It's like a pilot's version of synchronized swimming. Timing's everything. The pilot will use the turn coordinator and the clock to execute these maneuvers.
And before doing any timed turns, it's super important to make sure that the turn coordinator is calibrated properly.
That's right. The analog source explains how to do this by timing a standard rate turn and then checking if the heading indicator shows the correct number of degrees. It's kind of like making sure your measuring tape is accurate before you start cutting wood.
Yeah, so it's all about fine-tuning that instrument for precision.
Precisely. Once it's calibrated, you can be confident that your time turns will be accurate.
Now let's talk about that kind of old-school navigation tool, the magnetic compass. It might seem a little outdated in the age of GPS, but our handbooks, they stress that it's still an essential backup for pilots.
Yeah, it's like the ultimate fallback because it doesn't rely on any kind of external power source. It just uses the Earth's magnetic field, which is pretty reliable, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. But as anyone who's used a compass knows, there are those pesky compass errors that can kind of throw you off.
especially during turns. Our analog source reminds us about the need to adjust for these errors when turning near north or south headings. The compass, it doesn't instantly align with the plane's heading, so you have to anticipate its lag.
Oh, it's just like trying to read a sign while you're spinning around.
Exactly.
The letters, they don't really stay in place.
But once you understand how the compass behaves, you can compensate for those errors.
So even with all the fancy technology we have today, the humble magnetic compass is still an essential tool for pilots.
For sure.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most reliable, especially when you're flying in the air.
That's a valuable lesson in any field, really. Now let's talk about steep turns, which are a step up in terms of difficulty.
Okay, they sound a little bit more adventurous. Are we talking about those dramatic banked turns you see in, like, the movies?
Well, maybe not quite as dramatic, but they definitely require a higher level of precision and control.
Yeah.
Our EFD source defines steep turns as anything over 30 degrees of bank.
And our analog source has this great diagram showing a plane banked at 45 degrees. You can really see how much those forces on the plane increase during these maneuvers.
Exactly. As you increase the bank angle, you actually lose some of the vertical lift that's keeping the plane in the air. So you have to pull back on the yoke to compensate for that.
And with more lift comes more drag, which means you have to add power to maintain your speed.
It's a delicate balancing act, coordinating all these control inputs to maintain that smooth, controlled turn.
I can imagine how easy it would be to overbank and lose control, especially when you can't see the horizon for reference.
Right. That's why it's so crucial to practice these maneuvers in a safe environment with a qualified instructor. Both sources really emphasize the importance of building up your skill and confidence before attempting steep turns in those real-world conditions.
So we've covered takeoffs, all sorts of turns, even steep turns. But what happens when things go wrong and the plane ends up in an unusual attitude?
That's when things can get really disorienting and potentially dangerous if the pilot doesn't react quickly and correctly. That's why our handbooks dedicate a good chunk of their pages to unusual attitude recovery.
Yeah, the analog source goes into detail about how to recognize these situations based on your instruments. For example, if you're nose high, your airspeed will be decreasing, the altimeter will show you're climbing, and the vertical speed indicator will be trending downwards.
And the opposite happens if you're nose low, increasing airspeed, descending altimeter, and an upward trend on that VSI.
So it's all about recognizing those patterns and knowing what they actually mean.
Exactly. And once you've identified the problem, you need to apply the right control inputs to recover.
The analog source outlines a specific sequence for this. First address the pitch, then the bank, and finally the power. It's like a systematic approach to get the plane back under control as quickly and safely as possible.
While the analog source focuses on instrument interpretation and control inputs, our EFD source highlights some of the technology that can help in these situations.
Right. We talked earlier about how some EFDs have features that provide visual cues and guidance, like those red chevrons that point you back to the horizon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And some systems, they even declutter the display to show only the most critical information, which can be a huge lifesaver in a high-stress situation.
Yeah, it's like having a co-pilot who steps in and says, okay, here's what you need to focus on right now.
It really shows how technology is constantly evolving to make flying safer and more manageable, even in challenging conditions.
So we've covered so much ground today, from basic maneuvers to unusual attitude recovery. It's amazing to think that pilots can fly so safely and accurately, even when they can't see where they're going. It really makes you appreciate the skill and mental discipline that's required to be an instrument pilot.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in this final part of our deep dive, we're going kind of beyond these individual maneuvers and into the realm of instrument flight patterns.
So like choreographed routines for airplanes.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Pilots practice these patterns to hone their skills and prepare for those real-world scenarios that they might encounter during instrument flights.
Okay, our handbooks mention a variety of these patterns, including holding patterns, procedure turns, and different types of approaches. Let's start with the racetrack pattern. It sounds pretty straightforward.
It is, relatively speaking. It involves flying a rectangular course, combining straight and level flight with those standard rate turns. Our analog source gives some specific timings for each leg of the pattern.
So it's like a timed obstacle course in the sky, testing the pilot's ability to maintain that precise control while navigating solely by their instruments.
Precisely. It helps them develop a feel for the aircraft's performance and their own ability to stay on track.
Now, what about procedure turns? Those sound a little bit more complex.
They are a bit more involved. Procedure turns are used when a pilot needs to reverse direction, descend to a specific altitude, and then intercept that final approach course for landing.
So it's like a 3-in-1 maneuver.
Exactly. It streamlines the transition from the en route phase of flight to the approach phase. And there are actually several types of procedure turns, each with its own set of steps and timings.
Our analog source describes three of them. The standard 45-degree procedure, turn, the 8260 turn, and the teardrop turn. Why so many variations?
Think of it like having different tools in a toolbox. The type of procedure turn used depends on factors like the specific approach that's being flown, the surrounding terrain, the weather conditions, and even the pilot's preference.
So it's about having options and choosing the best tool for the job. What about those circling approach patterns I've heard about? Are those for when a pilot needs to make a dramatic last-minute change of plans?
Not exactly. Circling approaches are used when landing at airports that don't have instrument landing systems, or when the weather conditions prevent a straight-in approach.
Okay, our analog source diagrams a couple of these common circling approach patterns, both involving a series of turns and descents, to position the plane for a visual landing.
These patterns require a high level of precision and situational awareness. The pilot has to maintain a safe altitude while maneuvering close proximity to the ground, all while transitioning from instrument flight to visual flight for that final landing.
That sounds incredibly challenging. It really highlights the flexibility and adaptability that's required of instrument pilots.
They really do have to be prepared for anything. And we've only just scratched the surface of instrument flying in this deep dive.
I know, right? We've decoded the language of those cockpit instruments, explored how pilots use them to build a mental picture of their position, and even touched on how technology is making instrument flying safer and more accessible.
It's a really complex and fascinating skill that allows pilots to navigate safely through all sorts of weather conditions.
So the next time you're on a flight and you can't see anything outside your window, you can really appreciate the level of expertise at work up there in the cockpit.
Absolutely. It's a real testament to human ingenuity, skill, and our ability to overcome challenges using technology and training.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the world of instrument flying. It's been an incredible journey learning how pilots navigate using their instruments and their wits.
And maybe we've even inspired a few armchair pilots out there.
If you want to learn even more, definitely check out some videos of instrument approaches or cockpit simulations online. It's amazing to see those maneuvers in action.
And until next time, keep your curiosity high and your horizons wide.